Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to talk about race in literature and history and how the perception has changed, the perceptions and issues have changed in those two contexts and the world. As I believe I have mentioned before, I am a homeschooler and this is my senior year. I have been given the authority to choose everything that I'm reading in literature, everything that I'm learning in every other subject, and my two favorite subjects are literature and history. So I am interlinking these two subjects together so that I can't learn, well, I can, but I would prefer to learn them alongside each other. This year I'm actually mainly focusing on ancient civilizations, but you guys don't care about that because I'm not actually talking about ancient civilizations today. Today I've decided to look into the history of racism and race in America. Also, briefly, I'll look into some British stuff. I've been working on this for about a month or two now. It's taken a bit longer just because some books have taken a long time to get here and longer time to read, so I was hoping to have this up in November, but then I ended up just not doing it in November. Here it is in December. Today I want to talk about the historical context and how it affects our world today with Uncle Tom's Cabin, To Kill a Mockingbird, Loving versus Virginia, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, Piecing Me Together, and The Hate U Give. So, all these books. Now that I feel like I have sufficiently explained this concept, I'm going to just jump in. This is no sort of philosophy debate at all. This isn't an analysis of our history. It's just, I wanted to see what books had to say about racism all the way back from when it was done through slavery, all the way to modern day, through the civil rights era, to now, when there's still stuff going on. And we'll talk more about that stuff in a minute, but I'll just continue now. We're going to start in 1852 when Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe was published. This book sparked debate and tensions between the North and the South, abolitionists and slavers, Quakers and Christians. Everyone was talking about this book, and it became really popular in a very short amount of time. Kind of like, I guess, The Hate U Give in 2017. I believe that's when it came out. There is a funny little anecdote of Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe meeting, and he says to her, "So this is the little lady who wrote the book that started this big war." And that's an interesting story, and I do believe they did actually meet. I haven't actually looked it up, but I kind of think that this quote may have been made up by the internet. I haven't actually done any research to figure that out. But the Civil War actually started in 1851, so I'm not sure if it was published in 1852, how he could claim that it started the Civil War. But it did definitely increase tensions between each side and definitely gave the abolitionists a tool to explain why they wanted slavery to be abolished and to show the cruelty of slavery. Also, no matter how much people would like to think that it is, slavery is actually not the cause of the Civil War. It did have definitely helped start it, but it was mostly because the free states and the slave states could not agree whether or not the new states that were coming into the Union, if they would be free or slave. So there was a whole bunch of debating over that, and then Abraham Lincoln became president, and a bunch of the Southerners didn't want him to become president because they feared that he would abolish slavery, which he actually said that he was not going to do that because he didn't think it was something that needed... He believed that slavery was something that needed to be gotten rid of over a period of time instead of just in one fell swoop. So the slave states, one by one, started seceding from the Union, creating the Confederate States, and then something with a battle of Fort Sumter. And I don't exactly remember that part, but I think the Southerners attacked the Northerners. And then they got mad and declared war. Or something like that. The idea that the Civil War is about slavery comes from like towards the end of the war. They needed a fighting cause because the Northerners were losing heart and just like, oh my gosh, just let them secede from the states. We're losing way too many people and resources. Let's just stop doing this. To get them to rally together and push through this war, the Emancipation Proclamation was created and Abraham Lincoln put it into action, and that ultimately freed the slaves. And so that is how that happened. Obviously, I didn't give you much information about Uncle Tom's Cabin itself. I was more of just wanting to give you the historical background of how the slaves, how it kind of had to do with the Civil War, and then how the slaves were freed. Also, what this American Civil War really had to do with our country as a whole. There are historians who say that the American Civil War is really the turning point of our nation's history that could have crumbled it or could have built it up stronger, which it built it up stronger in the end, because it was still relatively a new thing by the time the Civil War came around, and people from all over the world were watching America to see if they would succeed in this grandiose plan of constitutional republic would continue. And the Civil War proved that it did and could and would go on to. That would be the relevance of Uncle Tom's Cabin with racism in America today. Next book I have on my list is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This book was published in 1960, but is set in the Depression era of the 1930s. Now you have to remember the 1930s was followed the Roaring Twenties, which happened right after World War I, and I like to think of the Roaring Twenties as America trying to just ignore all the depression that it was going through during World War I, and then the Great Depression came around and they were like, oh yeah, the world is depressing. And then after 1930s, obviously we joined World War II. I don't actually have any evidence to back up that that was what the 1920s was, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the context of this video. It's just a theory that I really should go and research and see if they really were just trying to ignore all their problems, which eventually resurfaced in the 1930s via the Great Depression. And then you also have to understand the context of when the book was made. So it was written in the 1950s by Harper Lee, when the civil rights era was starting, and discussions about interracial marriages were being talked about, segregation, and then obviously removing the segregation. The government issued the Civil Rights Act in 1957. Martin Luther King Jr. was on the scene doing all his work with just the civil rights movement, and also there was bus boycotting going on, just a lot, and a bunch of different cases that you can go look up on the internet. So that's just the background of To Kill a Mockingbird in its setting, and when it was written, and the kind of world that it was published into. This book is about a black man going on trial for allegedly raping a white girl. It's told from the perspective of a young white girl who her father is the lawyer for the man. One of the lessons the Girl Scout learns is that sometimes you need to continue fighting even if you know you're going to lose, which is the whole premise and context of this case and this novel. Atticus Finch, Scout's father, the lawyer of Tom Robinson, the black man, goes into this case knowing that he will lose because there's no way a white jury is going to let a black man go free. Despite making a rock-solid case for Tom Robinson, proving that he is innocent, Tom Robinson is still found guilty, sent to prison, and when he tries to escape and then gets shot in the process. This book took the nation by storm, and kind of like Uncle Tom's Cabin, Uncle Tom's Cabin sparked debate around a issue that was already talked about, and To Kill a Mockingbird was the same kind of thing. It sparked debate about an issue that people were already talking about and going through in that day. The next 4 books here have all been written since 2015. So they're all modern, new books compared to these 2, which were written in their time for their time. This book takes place during the Civil Rights era, and it is Loving versus Virginia. It is the true story of Richard and Mildred Loving, who were married as teenagers in Washington, D.C. because they could not get married in Virginia because of interracial marriage laws. When they came back to Virginia after getting married in Washington, D.C., they tried to live together, but then the police came in one night and arrested them because they were criminals, pretty much. The Lovings were given a choice to either spend a year in jail or to be banished from Virginia for 25 years. They took the latter because they don't want to live in jail, and they had a child at this time. So they moved to Washington, D.C., and they could only ever visit Virginia separately. They could never come at the same time together. They eventually made a case for themselves and their situation with the help of a lawyer and got their case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I think it was about 10 years later, in 1965 or 1967, the Supreme Court granted them the right to live as a married couple in Virginia. And they took down, because of this case, they took down interracial marriage laws all over the country. I think there were 16 states that prohibited interracial marriages, and all of them were banned. Obviously, this story is important because it definitely helped the civil rights era and the civil rights movement along. But for a moment, we're going to be jumping into British race relations. However, everything in this book is still very applicable to America. Why I'm no longer talking to white people about race is about structural racism, the fact that colorblindness is a childish idea, and the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's about class and white privilege. This book was written in 2017. It blew up the media and gave people a chance and an opportunity to talk about race, which is why I think these next 2 books I'm going to mention it was sort of created a pathway for them to be highlighted in the media. But what I liked about this book is that it talked about the history. So I've already talked about the history of everything. This one specifically talks about British history because it's written by a British author. It talks about William Wilberforce and how his journey through abolishing slavery. It also talked about the civil rights kind of era that Britain had in the 1900s, and also how Britain kind of looked at the American civil rights era as a model for how Britain should be, and now apparently they're more progressive than us. She talks about all of this and also how it has developed this structural racism in the world we live in today, and how now people think that they're not racist because, oh, I don't see color, I'm colorblind, figuratively. This book also kind of redefined what racism is. It brought the topic back up in just everyone's and my mind, what racism exactly is, because I think we've kind of lost the idea of what it is in our modern day society, because we do still have it. It's just a lot harder to detect now. In 2017, Piecing Me Together was published by Renee Watson. Piecing Me Together is about Jade, a black girl who joins a mentorship program called Women to Women in order to gain a scholarship for her future college applications. Because Jade comes from a poor part of Portland, Oregon, and she's black, and she goes to a rich private school, and she's very smart, this mentorship program called Women to Women approaches her and says that if you join, we'll give you a scholarship to any college that you're going to end up going to. She's very smart and she has bright dreams for the future, and so she takes this woman-to-woman program even though she feels like it's a bit demeaning, and it turns out that it actually kind of is. Through this book, they talk about Black culture and Black stereotypes, and also how as white people we kind of try to train Black people through these mentorship programs to be more white instead of Black. Jade has to fight against Black stereotypes and how people observe her problems to be instead of what they actually are, and she has to go through the book trying to explain to people what is actually going on in her life instead of just what they assume is from her outside appearance. As a society, we've come a very long way from the slavery and the civil rights era, but this book still shows us that we still have problems that we need to address concerning race, and through Black stereotypes and people judging Jade for her outside appearance and what her problems might be instead of asking her what they actually are. The final book I would like to talk about is the one that everyone knows about. It is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. This book talks about the Black Lives Matter movement and how it is affecting the world today and how it can change the world, and also kind of a Black perspectives of the world and the society we live in today in America, and how it can be improved, how there can be justice for all people. Obviously, the issues discussed in these two books have not resolved themselves yet. Hopefully in the future, though, we will see some kind of resolution as we did with these 3 issues. I highly recommend, if you want to go read a nonfiction book about race and how it relates to our modern world, to go read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. As for that, that's all I have for today. Not talking anymore. I'm just gonna say bye and see ya.